Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 131, the Jinshin no Ran Part 3, Fighting in the Nara Basin. Maro stood under the tsuki tree and gazed at the walls of the great temple. The gates and tiled roof were truly an incredible sight. Maro's home wasn't that far away, but until he'd been called up for service to the government, he hadn't thought much beyond the valley where he and his family tilled the land. Their life had been largely spent in the village, tucked up in the valley, farming rice, hunting in the mountains, and gathering firewood. He remembered how years ago his brothers had been the ones to go and do their service. They had been called up to build some kind of giant fortress on the top of a mountain. The stories they brought back were frankly incredible. I mean, it was one thing to hear tales of the outside world from merchants and itinerant priests, but it was different to hear them from someone you actually knew. And now, it was Maro's turn to experience it himself. But he hadn't been called up for labor. No, he was going to have to fight. He tried to psych himself up. Many of the men, and frankly, young boys who were there with him, were all in a similar boat. Some were old hands at this point, having served multiple times. Others were new and, like Maro, there for their very first time. None of them were professional soldiers, though you wouldn't know that by the way some of them swaggered through the camp. They'd been called up quickly with only a little information. Apparently Prince Oama, they were told, had rebelled against the government. He and his men were gathering in the east, and at any moment they could attack the capital in Otsu, and from there they would swing down and attack the ancient capital in Asuka. So here they were. Several hundred conscripts, pulled from households around the ancient capital, gathered and waiting for their weapons and armor so that they could then get their marching orders. Quite literally. Suddenly, Maro heard a commotion in the north. He couldn't see what was happening, but the murmurs turned to shouting. Prince Takechi, the son of that demonic rebel, Oama, was here, coming back from the north with hundreds of expert soldiers on horseback. Panic set in, and even though a few of the officers tried to quell the disturbance, it wasn't enough. Afraid for what might come, Maro and those like him broke ranks and fled. Maro gave little thought to what might happen to his family and friends if he deserted. He was no longer thinking rationally. Along with his compatriots, his would-be brothers in arms, if they'd been given any, he hoped that he could hide and that, if he survived, then maybe, just maybe, he could somehow make it back home in one piece. Welcome back. Content warning for this episode. We are going to be talking about war, including death, fighting, and suicide. As I noted at the start, this is part 3 of our look at the Jinshin no Ran, the Jinshin War, sometimes translated as a disturbance or a rebellion. This was the war between the supporters of Prince Oama, also known as Tenmu, and Prince Otomo, aka Kobun. Oama's side is sometimes called the Yoshino or even the Yamato court, as he had quote-unquote retired from the world and become a monk at a temple in Yoshino, south of Asuka, in the old area of Yamato. Meanwhile, Otomo's supporters were the Omi court, including most of the ministers running the state from the capital in Otsu on the shores of Lake Biwa, the area known as Omi. So let's take a look back at what has happened so far, and then we can get into the events we're talking about today, which is a look at the soldiers who were fighting, their gear, and some of the fighting that went on, specifically the fighting that happened in the Nara Basin. I'll do my best to organize things based on the rough timeline that seems to have occurred. Now, previously, we had covered how Oama, brother to Nakano Oe, aka Tenshi Tenno, had given up his title as crown prince and retired, supposedly to prevent any concerns that he might rebel and try to take the throne. But this wasn't enough for Otomo and the court, who had begun to raise forces against him. And so Oama and his supporters had just made a desperate dash eastward, across the mountain road to Ise. From there, they secured the Fuwa and Suzuka passes, two of the main routes to the east countries. Oama had then sent out requests for assistance to those same countries, hoping to find allies who would support him against the apparently legitimate government in Otsu. We are told that Oama was joined at this time by two of his sons, Prince Takechi and Prince Otsu. And here I want to pause to note something that I didn't quite point out last episode. These princes were not quite as old as you might think from the way they are portrayed in the Chronicle. Prince Takechi, who'd been given command of the troops at the Fuwa barrier, he was only 19 years old. Granted, that is only 4 years younger than their rival, Prince Otomo, and only a couple of years younger than the famous Minamoto Yoshitsune would be when he joined his brother in the Genpei Wars over 500 years later. Prince Otsu, however, was a bit younger than this, as he's believed to have been about 10 years old at this time, which likely explains why he's not really so prominent in the narrative. I mention this because the Nihon Shoki often omits details like age and can make it seem like these were all seasoned adult men and women, when it may have been that they were simply of high enough status to be mentioned, even though others may have actually been running the affairs for them. I mean, I doubt it was a 10-year-old that was leading people through the Suzuka Pass pretending to be someone else. For some reason, I think that may have been someone else's idea. Now, in Prince Takechi's case, while he was likely old enough to take charge of the forces at Fuwa, it's also clear that his father was nearby and overseeing things, so everything didn't rest solely on his son's shoulders. Meanwhile, the Omi court was raising its own soldiers. While their delegation to the east was stopped at the captured Fuwa Pass, they also had sent word to the west. Kibi and Tsukushi are specifically mentioned, but we know that they were raising troops elsewhere, including in the home province regions of Yamato and Kawachi. Here it should be noted that the Nihon Shoki is pretty clearly pro-Tenmu, in other words, pro-Oama. There is some evidence from textual analysis, however, that the Tenmu portions of the narrative actually differ from the Tenchi portions. Torkel Duthie, in his book, Manyoshu and the Imperial Imagination in Early Japan, recounts how scholarship has identified at least 2, possibly 3 different groups of compilers who manage different reigns. The Tenchi narrative is more neutral in this case, while the Tenmu narrative provides a bit more of an accusatory tone, and both narratives provide slightly different accounts of the very same events, notably around the death of Nakano Oe, Prince Oama taking vows, and Prince Otomo succeeding his father. On the other side, Duthie mentions the Kaifuso, a collection of Sinitic-style poetry created in 751, just 31 years after the Nihon Shoki, where in the introduction, the author seems to be much more sympathetic to Prince Otomo and his cause, implying that Oama was the one rising up against the legitimate government. I mention this just to help us remember that our primary source is not exactly neutral about any of this, and we should keep that in mind as we're trying to sort out what was going on. The narrative also makes it seem as though the outcome was inevitable, but we should also remember that at the time, the people involved couldn't have known how things were going to turn out. In that moment, anything could have happened, especially in times of war. Speaking of which, we know that the two sides were raising troops, so let's talk about what we know about these troops and what combat may have looked like at the time. While we don't exactly have detailed accounts, there is a lot we can piece together through the archaeological record and other sources. To that end, we have evidence of armor and weapons, as well as shields, and we can also look at Haniwa through the 6th and even early 7th century to give us an idea of local armor styles. Let's first look back on how soldiers were conscripted. Each household seems to have been responsible for supplying a soldier when required. They were also to supply their equipment. That included a sword, armor, bows and arrows, as well as a flag and drum. In historical parades today, we often see row upon row of soldier kitted out in matching clothing, appearing relatively cohesive and well-regimented. In truth, however, it's really hard to know just how similar any one group might have been. Based on later historical examples, it's safe to assume that many of the soldiers may not have had much armor, if any, and even if they did, it might have been made of wood or leather, which were unlikely to survive to the modern day. Of course, I would also question just how often they were able to afford everything mentioned that they were supposed to supply. And since we're told that as the government was gathering soldiers, it was also opening storehouses of weapons and armor, I really suspect that indicates that not everyone had their own. Even if they did, it may have been of questionable quality. That said, if a warrior did have armor, it was likely one of two types, a variation of which were both found on the continent. The first type is characterized by a solid, circular cuirass, often called a tanko or short armor. These were made of strips of iron that were shaped on a wooden form and then riveted or tied together into a solid cuirass, which is why it is also called a type of plate armor. One side of the armor was hinged and could open so that the wearer could get in, and there are some tanko with a hanging skirt of tassets that flare out as well, protecting the legs, and even examples of pieces that go around the neck, shoulder guards, and arm guards. The tanko itself seems to date from at least the 3rd or 4th century, with changes in design over time, and we know that it continued through at least the 6th century. Compare this to the keiko, or hanging armor. Keiko was a kind of lamellar armor made of individual scales, later known as sane. These metal scales, also known as lamellae, were held together with lacing and made for a much more flexible and presumably comfortable armor. The trade-off for this comfort was that the keiko likely took a lot more labor to make and thus were considered a more elite armor, possibly used by men on horseback or at least those leading the troops. Now, looking into the future a bit, we know that in the 8th century there were tanko and keiko being donated to the Shōsōin repository at Todaiji, or at least that's what's written in the record. However, it isn't clear that the tanko and keiko mentioned in the 8th century referred to exactly this kind of armor that we know it as today, and we may have been dealing with something else entirely because, well, there's a lacuna in our understanding of armor on the archipelago between the end of the Asuka period and the appearance of the more familiar yoroi in the Heian period. There are conjectured transitional armors based on continental models, which are thought to have been used. Still, at this very point in time, when Ōama is mounting his rebellion against Otomo, the keiko and tanko are generally thought to have still been in use, and this is usually how you'll see the two sides represented. As for weapons, perhaps the most common we see is the bow and arrow. Archery is extremely practical, not only for its ability to be used from a distance, but also because in times of peace, people can use the same bows to hunt, thus making hunting prowess a kind of stand-in for military prowess. In fact, the way of the horse and bow, or kyuba no michi, would be the main pillar of martial prowess in the archipelago for centuries. The iconic sword, while important, it was, after all, one of the 3 sacred regalia, was more of a sidearm deployed in close quarters combat. I mean, it was still important, as it could be easily carried with you. However, it is more likely that massed troops might have had spears and various types of polearms providing reach. Those are harder to just casually carry around, however, especially if you're mainly using a bow. And perhaps that's part of the reason that we don't hear as much about such weapons, and most of the focus seems to be on the archers and on the swords. There were also at this time shields. Now, we know that the Hayato of southern Kyushu were particularly known for them, but there's evidence that they were more widely used. After all, a shield made of wood would have made an important defense against a rain of arrows coming from the enemy. As for the horses, well, some of them may even have had their own barding or armor, though I suspect again that was rare and reserved for elites. Then again, horses were reserved for elites. All of this together gives us some idea of what it may have looked like when Ōama and Otomo's forces engaged in battle, though it is still largely conjecture. We know that they had spears and swords and bows. We know that some of the first men that Prince Ōama picked up on his journey were archers that he conscripted into service, who were then pressed into taking a government post station. We also don't necessarily see a lot of individual fighting described in the records, though there are exceptions. Later on, there was a tradition of individual warriors calling out challenges in the midst of battle, and that became an accepted practice in the early culture of the Bushi or samurai, but we don't really see that in the Chronicles. Certainly we see moments of individual valor which are remembered, likely because of the benefits that the hero's descendants could then claim for themselves. But for the most part, it seems that the people actually doing the fighting were groups of conscripted soldiers, not the hired warriors of later periods. Even among groups like the Mononobe, the Bay of Warriors, it isn't clear that they would have been the ones on the front lines, not if they could help it anyway. Most of those were farmers and similar commoners who were called up to fight as necessary. Some of them may have seen action over on the Korean Peninsula or even in local skirmishes. Others would have been fresh out of the fields, joining the ranks for the very first time. They were not exactly volunteers, but they didn't really have much of a choice. It was the draft on steroids. I also suspect that the act of conscription, where a soldier was offered up by a household or family, meant that desertion would also mean that their family would be punished. While the elite generals providing the men were no doubt gauging how this would affect their own political and economic fortunes, I imagine that the average soldier had much less agency and could look forward to many fewer rewards. In fact, I suspect his main goal would have been one of survival. Now, perhaps if one fought well, they would earn something more for themselves, and perhaps there were cultural concepts of loyalty to one's local elites and leadership. And maybe there were leaders who inspired them to do great things. However, works like the Nihon Shoki were rarely concerned with the lives of the common people, except when it shined a light on the sovereigns and their court. It was much more concerned with how this affected the upper caste of society. There's also the question about just what kind of fighting this system led to. Again, these are not the bushi, the warrior class who prided themselves on their martial prowess, and neither were they standing armies. While there were likely some who regularly served and trained and found that they had a skill at war, how many were simple farmers who were now holding a spear instead of a spade? These are things to keep in mind as we follow along with tales of glorious victory or ignoble defeat. So that's a glimpse at who was actually doing the fighting. As for the timeline of the battle, well, let's get into it. First, a caveat. As we should be used to by now, the exact chronology of events listed in the Nihon Shoki is not entirely clear or even trustworthy. The Nihon Shoki provides a narrative, but often it includes actions that took several days or even weeks and condenses it to a single date where the events apparently culminated. Now, using clues such as one day later or similar things, we can piece together a narrative, but I have to admit, I'm not even sure that this is 100% accurate. It doesn't help that the Nihon Shoki seems to focus on different campaigns separately, even though much of it was happening all at the same time. And that's compounded by the fact that all of this was being recorded much, much later. So there's also a great possibility that even some of the seemingly clear dates were also wrong, or were adjusted to make for a better flow in the narrative. So I'm going to do my best to piece together what I roughly feel was the chronological order, but just be aware that dates may not be all that precise, and forgive me if I get a thing out of place here or there. Now, in the coming conflict, we see several main arenas. First, there is the area around Lake Biwa, from the Fuwa Pass toward Otsu. This was Oama's main path to try and put an end to this whole affair, to make his way to Otsu, the capital, and then cut the head off the snake. To do that, he would have to leave his defensive position and venture out around the lake, where Omi forces no doubt lay in wait. At the same time, there was also fierce fighting in the Nara Basin, with Yoshino and Omi forces clashing there across the plains. And we cannot forget the Kafuka or Koka Pass, which led over the mountains and eventually to Suzuka. If the Omi forces could push through to Suzuka, then they could march along the coastal plains of Mie up through Owari and come at Oama's forces from behind. In previous episodes, we covered the lead up to this part of the conflict, and while there had been some fighting at the post stations on the road to Suzuka, as well as captured envoys at the Fuwa Pass, so far I wouldn't say we've seen any major fighting. If the timeline in the Nihon Shoki is to be believed, the first serious clashes seems to have occurred in the Yamato region and the Nara Basin. In general, however, there seems to have been two main campaigns. There was the fighting in the Nara Basin, and then there was the fighting along the shores of Lake Biwa. Everything started off at the end of the 6th month, with Oama's mad dash to capture the passes at Suzuka and Fuwa, where he waited while he gathered up men from the eastern countries. So while that was happening, the Omi court was out recruiting men for their own war. This would lead to some of the earliest formal battles between the two sides taking place in the Nara Basin, originally a recruitment center, and it turned into a battle zone. Now, Yoshino-aligned forces would push north only to be blocked by armies coming down from the capital at Otsu, as well as forces coming through the gap between Yamato and Kawachi, where the Yamato River leaves the basin through the western mountains. The fighting happened largely over the course of a week or so. It started around the 29th day of the 6th month and seems to have ended between the 4th or 6th day of the 7th month, so just keep that in mind. As you may recall from the last episode, there were two brothers, Otomo no Muraji no Makuda and Otomo no Muraji no Fukei, who, upon hearing that Oama was rising up, both feigned illnesses, using that as an excuse to leave the court at Otsu and return to their family compounds in the Yamato region. From there, Makuda made haste to catch up with Oama and his men, but his brother Fukei stayed behind to see what he could do in Yamato. Originally, Fukei's success was limited. He started calling various allied families together and tried to drum up support for Oama, but he could only gather a few tens of men, not the hundreds, let alone thousands, that he would really need. At the same time, the Omi court was conscripting men of the Yamato region into service. This was being organized by Hodzumi no Obito no Momotari and his younger brother, Hodzumi no Obito no Ioye, along with Mononobe no Obito no Hyuga, who had also been sent along with them to Yamato on the orders of the Omi court, apparently arriving shortly after Fukei and his brother. This group set up their base of operations, it seems, at the Okamoto Palace. It was, after all, the official government presence, and they were the official government representatives. And they used the grounds west of Hokoji, aka Asukadera, as their assembly grounds. Otomo no Fukei knew that something would have to be done. If those conscripted Yamato soldiers were formed into a proper army and sent out, it could cause a lot of problems for Oama and his men. And fortunately, Fukei had a man on the inside. Apparent ally Sakano Ue no Atae no Kumage, the officer in charge of the Okamoto Palace, working for none other than Prince Takazaka, who resided there. And so Fukei had a plan. He would impersonate the royal Prince Takechi, son of Oama, and pretend to lead a force of cavalry to attack the camp at Asukadera. To strengthen the illusion, Fukei would come in from the north, which is where Prince Takechi and his men would presumably be coming from. Now, remember, Fukei only had tens of people that were actually on his side at this point. The camp was presumably much larger. If they didn't fall for his ruse, Fukei would be marching straight to his death. Fukei marshaled his troops at the house of Kudara, which is to say Baekje, and then left out of the south gate. He then had an accomplice, Hara no Miyatsuko no Kuma, dress in nothing but a loincloth, mount a horse, and gallop as fast as he could toward the camp. Now you can imagine the confusion in the camp as this wild, naked man gallops up to them in a panic and starts telling them that Prince Takechi and his men were on their way with a huge force. And when the conscripted soldiers heard this, when they looked and maybe saw the first horses in the distance, they panicked. While the men were gathered, it seems that they hadn't yet been outfitted with many weapons and armor, and so the entire camp broke and fled. And so Fukei was able to waltz in with his tens of men and take the camp at Asukadera, capturing Prince Takazaka and those sent from Otsu to levy troops. Fukei's ally, Kumage, the man on the inside, helped with this along with the soldiers under the command of him and the Aya no Atae. And so they were able to disperse the conscripted Yamato forces before they were even assembled. However, it turned out that someone was missing. Hodzumi no Omi no Momotari, who had been appointed the leader of this operation, was not at Asukadera at the time of the raid. It turns out that he was over at the Oharida Palace, where he was reviewing the armory, taking out the weapons and armor for the troops that he thought were still over at Asukadera. So Fukei continued the ruse. He sent a messenger to summon Momotari, claiming to be a summon from none other than Prince Takechi himself. Momotari, hearing this, likely knew he had lost, but he apparently maintained his dignity. He didn't run away or rush to the camp. Instead, he approached on horseback in what we are told is a leisurely fashion. When he reached the encampment, now under Fukei's command, one of the soldiers shouted at Momotari to get off his horse, but Momotari, likely trying to keep what remained of his dignity, was slow in doing so. The men around him didn't care one whit for his dignity, however. They grabbed his collar and pulled him off his horse, dragging him to the ground. He was shot with an arrow, and then a man drew his sword and struck him and killed him. We aren't even told who did this deed, just how it was done. As for the others, Momotari's brother, Hozumi no Ioe, and Mononobe no Hyuga, well, they were bound, but eventually they were released amongst the troops, where they were no doubt watched carefully. Princes Takazaka no O and Wakasa no O, the representatives of the Omi court there in Asuka, were allowed to follow behind the army. With this victory under his belt, Otomo no Fukei sent messengers to Prince Oama at the Fuwa Pass to let him know what had happened. And when the messengers finally reached Oama, we're told that he was quite pleased with the result. After all, it meant that his rear guard was that much more secure. We are told that these events took place on or about the 29th day of the 6th month, around the same time that Oama was overseeing troops at Wazami, only a few days after he and the real Prince Takechi had made their way to that camp. Things were evolving quickly. Now Fukei's success drew others to his banner. Miwa no Kimi no Takechi Maru, Kamo no Kimi no Emishi, and others all joined Fukei's forces, like an echo, we are told. With now a more sizable force, it seems that Fukei believed he was ready to take the fight to the Omi court. He and his advisors drew up plans for invading Omi, selecting men to be deputy commanders and military commanders, providing a hierarchy and some organization to this newly minted army. From there, a few days later, he began to march north from Asuka towards Nara. Now, Nara at this point was really just a name for the northwest area of the basin. They probably didn't even think of it as the Nara Basin back then, but it was along the road that led north through the mountains, and from there through Yamashiro and eventually on to Omi. As Fukei was headed north, however, he received word that there was another force coming from the land of Kawachi in the west, and so he split his forces. Sakamoto no Omi no Takara and others were sent with some 300 troops to take a defensive position at Tatsuta. Sami no Kimi no Sukunamaro was also sent with another several hundred men to Osaka. But no, not that Osaka. Afusaka in modern Kashiba in western Nara Basin. This area would have been a strategic defensive point for any troops taking the road from Kawachi, so if anyone got past Sakamoto no Takara, Sukunamaro and his troops would be waiting. The now General Fukei also sent Kamo no Emishi with another several hundred men to guard the Iwate Road to defend that approach as well. Sakamoto no Takara, who had been sent to engage with troops coming from Kawachi, reached the area of Hiraishi when he heard that Omi forces were occupying the nearby castle of Takayasu Mountain. You may recall that Takayasu was one of the Korean-style fortresses that had been built in anticipation of a possible invasion from the continent, and it had even been repaired a few times. Now it was being used not against an outside enemy, but in an internal conflict. Takara and his men marched up the mountain, intending to attack the castle, and here we should probably give a better idea of just what this castle was probably like. So if you think of a modern Japanese castle, the thing that likely stands out, no pun intended, is the Tenshukaku, or donjon, the multi-storied tower located somewhere inside the walls and moats of the castle proper. This would be an ideal location to spy over the walls and see where the enemy were, as well as an area from which one could make a last-ditch stand if necessary. The castles of the Asuka period were not like this. They were built off of continental models, and their defining feature was not the donjon, though they likely did have a gate and guard towers set up so that one could see over the walls to the attacking forces. No. The defining feature was really the walls. Long, compacted earth walls, possibly lined with stone, which snaked around the top of a mountain. This castle style leveraged the natural contours of existing mountaintops to provide its defense. It didn't hurt that they also provided clear views of what was happening on the plains below, and that it required attacking troops to march up a steep mountain and then attack uphill. The trade-off was that these weren't the kind of places that people would really want to live when most of the infrastructure of the state was in the fertile plains and surrounding areas. So these castles had granaries to keep troops fed and perhaps some basic buildings erected within the walls, but they were largely a practical design. Now you can still go see the Takayasu ruins today, and you don't have to hike up the mountain as Takara and his men did. Instead, you can actually take a cable car up to the top, or even a regular car on the roads that drive up to the old castle site, though how much you can see today, I'm not entirely sure. There are also other castle ruins and even old Kofun on the mountain, as its prominence has been recognized as important in many different centuries. Now, there likely weren't a lot of troops manning the castle, certainly not enough that they felt they had much of a chance defending it. So when Takara and his men made it up to the top, the Omi forces burned the granaries so as to deny him any supplies, and then took off, discretion being the better part of valor. Takara and his men spent the evening at the castle, no doubt recovering from their hike up. And remember, this wasn't just a leisurely stroll, they were no doubt fully kitted out for war. And when they woke the next morning, they looked out over the surrounding countryside, of which they now had fantastic views, and Takara noticed a large army coming down along the Otsu-Taji road. They carried flags, which I don't know how Takara could have seen at that point, but they identified them as being the enemy, specifically troops of the Omi general Iki no Fubito no Karakuni. And so Takara and his men descended from Takayasu, crossed the Ega River, now known as the Ishii River, and engaged Karakuni's army. They were only 300 men, however, and they just climbed up a mountain and back down. And Karakuni, meanwhile, had a much larger force, so Takara and his men were unable to maintain a defense. And so they made a strategic withdrawal. In other words, they retreated back to Kashikosaka, apparently a part of Osaka, where Kino Omi no Oto had been set to guard. So Otomo and the Omi court finally scored a win. Now, besides his victory against Takara and his men, we are also told that Karakuni had come up upon Kume no Omi no Shihoko, the governor of Kawachi. Shihoko had been gathering troops to fight for Oama, but he was found out by Karakuni. Karakuni captured him and was going to execute him, but before he could, Shihoko took his own life instead. As Takara was retreating and setting up a new defensive position, Fuke had his own problems to worry about. As he was camped with his troops on Mount Narayama, one of his men, Aradao no Atae no Akamaro, addressed him and suggested they should make sure to fortify Asuka just in case. Fuke agreed with this and sent Akamaro as well as Imbe no Kobito to guard the Okamoto Palace in Asuka, and they also made sure to remove the planks from any bridges, using them to set up fortifications along the road. Now, any army that wished to cross would either have to swim or they would need to come across the narrow beams that were all that was left of the bridges. This was not ideal at the best of times, but you can imagine doing it as troops on the other side were shooting arrows at you. And yet, this has become a near classic trope in Japanese war stories, and it won't be the only time it comes up in various historical contexts. It wouldn't even be the only time it shows up in this current conflict. A day later, Fuke found himself engaged with an Omi general, Ono no Kimi no Hatayasu, on Mount Narayama itself. Despite Fuke having had time to set up a defensive position, the Omi forces overwhelmed Fuke's men. They were defeated, and Fuke himself barely escaped with his life. Fuke fled south with only 1 or 2 men, also on horseback, with Hatayasu hot on his heels, only stopping when they reached Hatta and the Yamato River. At that point, the fortifications were in place, and Hatayasu likely knew that any trying to cross the river would likely not go nearly as well as it did at Narayama. As for Fuke, well, he kept going all the way until he reached Sumizaka, apparently in Uda. There he fell in with Okizome no Muraji no Usagi at the head of several tens of thousands of men. Usagi, you see, had been with Oama, but upon hearing that there was fighting going on in Yamato, Oama had sent him and others to go back through the Suzuka Pass to provide reinforcements. One can only imagine how happy Fukei was at this point to see Usagi and all of these fresh men. Fukei turned back around and encamped at Kanatsunai, possibly modern Imaicho in Kashihara City. There, he was able to gather many of the dispersed troops back into a force once again. Now, about this time, Fukei heard that the Omi forces were also approaching along the Osaka Road. So now they were approaching from both the north and the west. They were also taking several different roads. Inside the largely flat area of the Nara Basin, they had several choices. Takara and Ooto had been unable to meet the enemy and had kept retreating, likely seeking a defensible position. As they did this, Fukei came from the east with his reinforcements, and he made it to where the roads branched at Tahema, modern Taima, where he fought with Ikino Karakuni nearby Ashiike Pond, possibly somewhere near modern Chimata. During the battle, one of Fukei's men, a brave warrior known to us only as Kume, drew his sword and rushed straight into the midst of the enemy army. Of course, one lone man wasn't likely to do much, but he inspired a cavalry charge, and the men on horseback followed closely at his heels. Seeing this whole force bearing down on them, the Omi troops broke, and soon it was a rout. Fukei's men pursued, cutting down the Omi soldiers as they fled, until Fukei finally reined them in. At this point, Fukei then admonished his troops that their goal was just to take out the ringleaders, not to indiscriminately go about murdering the common people. Remember, which side of the battlefield you ended up fighting on was largely a function of who had conscripted you, and Fukei evidently knew this. Also, if you think about it, these are the farmers. These are the people who are going to be growing the crops for next season, so if you kill all of them, well, it's going to be a pretty poor harvest. As the men were still retreating, though, Fukei noticed that the Omi general, Karakuni, one of those ringleaders, had gotten himself separated from his men. So Fukei ordered Kume, presumably the same one who had charged the army in the first place, to shoot at him, but Kume's arrows missed, and Karakuni made his escape. Rather than pursuing, Fukei returned back to his headquarters. Once there, Fukei now learned that there were enemy forces approaching from the east as well, so Fukei took the army and divided it into three, defending the upper, middle, and lower roads in the Nara Basin, and he took personal charge of the forces on the middle road, likely so that he could easily keep touch with the other forces. He was also waiting for the next challenge, and he didn't have to wait for long. The Omi general, Inukai no Muraji no Isogimi, approached along that very same middle road. He halted at Mureya, but his deputy commander, Iori no Miyatsuko no Kujira, attacked Fukei's camp with 200 specially picked soldiers. Now, it turns out when they reached the camp, there were only a few people actually there at the time, including one Tokumaro, described as a slave of Oidera Temple, and 4 people following the army. In other words, these might not have been actual soldiers. Nevertheless, together this small group rallied, formed an advance guard, and went forward, shooting arrows at Kujira's forces. Kujira, not realizing that Fukei's camp was all but empty, halted his advance. Meanwhile, over on the upper road, Miwa no Takechi Maro and Okizome no Usagi, who had been sent by Oama from Fuwa, fought with the Omi army at the Hashimisasagi, which we assume to mean the Hashihaka Kofun. And they overwhelmingly defeated the Omi army there, such that they were able to pivot from there and swing their forces over to the middle road. There they slammed into the flank of Kujira's army, who had stopped to trade blows with Fukei's camp. Many of the common soldiers were killed, and the general Kujira ran off, mounted on a white horse. Unfortunately for him, the horse took a misstep and tumbled into a muddy rice field, which would probably have been the majority of the flat area of the basin at the time. Kujira was bogged down in the mud and having a bit of a time getting out. General Fukei, seeing this, sent a brave soldier of Kai to shoot at Kujira. But as the soldier came to the edge of the rice paddy, Kujira whipped his horse vigorously and got it to extricate itself and Kujira, who galloped off and escaped. Fukei, for his part, returned again to the headquarters and camped with his men there. Though they were ready for another conflict, nothing ever came. The Omi forces had withdrawn, the battle for the Nara Basin was over, and the Yoshino forces were victorious. General Fouquet, however, was anything but finished. Remember, he had planned to take the fight to Omi, and so, having subdued the enemy forces in Yamato, which is to say the Nara Basin, Fouquet marched out through Osaka to Naniwa, and then marched on to Yamazaki, where he set up camp. From there, he sent messengers to all the governors of the western provinces. He forced them to give up their keys, their posting bells, and their posting tallies. Basically, he had them formally submit to the Yoshino faction, and thus to Owama. Meanwhile, Owama, he had his own campaign to conduct, and it kicked off in the middle of Fouquet's defense of the Yamato home province. He also would engage various generals in battle, but we'll save that campaign for part 4. Before we go, I do want to point out once again, this wasn't a simple and straightforward matter of attack and defense. Notice that generals on both sides sometimes were victorious and sometimes had to flee. You can only imagine how, after the defeat at Narayama, General Fouquet must have felt that all hope must have been lost, only to run into a force 10,000 strong come to relieve him and his paltry troops. But it could just as easily have been that he didn't make it. In fact, how many warriors died? Heroically, perhaps, but still died. And if there were no descendants to carry on their name and remember their deeds, then who knows how many people just didn't get written about at all. And then there were all of those common soldiers. Individuals without any recorded name, but who nonetheless were there and who fought. They may not have been the people that the later authors cared to write about, and yet they were all someone's child and possibly their sibling or parent. They loved and laughed and most certainly died. All to determine who would sit next upon the Yamato throne. One has to wonder if winning or losing really changed anything for them, or perhaps they won simply by surviving. And on that cheerful thought, I'll take my leave. Until next time, thank you once again for listening and for all of your support. If you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we do have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo. Or you can find links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we will have some more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, feel free to reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page, or you can email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. Thank you also to Ellen for their work editing the podcast. That's all for now. Thank you once again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.